When my landlady threatened to raise the rent, I gave her an answer that didn't just change the price, it changed her heart. I still remember the exact moment she said it. My landlady, Miss Harper, was leaning against the wooden frame of my apartment door, arms folded, her posture as elegant as it was firm. At 42, she carried herself with a grace that made every movement deliberate, measured. Her voice was steady when she spoke, as if she had rehearsed the words long before. You know, I could raise the rent. I glanced up from the small pile of books I had been sorting on the table. Her tone was casual, but her eyes gave her away. There was something beneath the surface, a quiet challenge, or maybe a test. I felt the weight of her gaze, and in that stillness, a dozen thoughts raced through my head. Most tenants would have nodded politely, maybe laughed awkwardly, but I wasn't most tenants. The words slipped out before I could stop them, low but steady, or lower your guard. For a heartbeat, time seemed to still. The hallway grew impossibly quiet, broken only by the faint hum of a ceiling fan somewhere above. She didn't move, but her expression betrayed her. Her lips parted ever so slightly, as though the remark had reached into a place she had carefully locked away. A flicker of surprise danced across her features, quickly masked by a half-smile that was more defense than amusement. Her hand lingered on the doorframe, fingertips brushing against the polished wood as if grounding herself. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing just enough to remind me of the authority she held. Yet in the soft light of the corridor, I caught something else, a hesitation, a momentary crack in the armor she wore so well. "Careful," she said softly, her voice carrying a warning but lacking true conviction. I smiled faintly, though my chest felt tighter than I wanted to admit. Something about her presence always unsettled me. Not in a threatening way, but in the way a storm unsettles the still air before it breaks. She was confident, independent, yet there was a quiet loneliness in the way she carried herself. When she finally turned to leave, her footsteps echoed down the hall with measured calm. But even as the sound faded, I remained frozen in place, her words and my reply replaying over and over in my mind. It wasn't just about rent. Not really. Something had shifted between us in that moment, something fragile, unspoken, but undeniable. And I realized, for the first time, that the space I was renting might cost me more than money. It might cost me my guarded heart. A few days later, I found her outside in the garden, crouched near the rose bushes that lined the edge of the property. It was late afternoon, the kind of golden hour where sunlight seems to soften everything it touches. She wore a loose linen shirt tucked into faded jeans, sleeves rolled just past her elbows. There was nothing overly glamorous about the way she looked, yet she carried a quiet dignity that made even simple tasks seem graceful. She was pulling weeds with one gloved hand and holding clippers in the other. But as I approached, I noticed she wasn't working so much as sitting still, staring at the blossoms with a faraway expression. For a moment, she seemed less like my landlady and more like a woman caught in a private memory. "Garden's looking beautiful," I said gently, careful not to intrude too harshly. She startled slightly, then forced a polite smile. "It takes work. Not everything grows just because you want it to." There was something in her tone, quiet, weighted. She placed the clippers in her lap, tugging at the gloves as if they were suddenly too tight. I sat down on the low stone wall beside her, leaving just enough space to show respect, but close enough that she would know I wasn't leaving. For a few seconds, she didn't speak. Only the faint rustle of leaves filled the silence. Finally, her shoulders dropped, and her voice softened. "It's been hard keeping this place running on my own. Some days it feels like the house owns me instead of the other way around." It wasn't a complaint, more like a confession she hadn't meant to share. I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I let the stillness stretch, as though giving her words the dignity they deserved. She sighed, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face, but it fell stubbornly back across her cheek. Without thinking, I reached out and gently tucked it behind her ear. My fingertips grazed her skin, warm and impossibly soft. Her breath caught, just a faint hitch, but I noticed it. For a heartbeat, her eyes lifted to mine, wide and unguarded. And though she didn't say a word, I felt the unspoken weight of her loneliness and strength collide in that look. She didn't pull away. She let me touch her, and in that simple act, something delicate shifted. In that golden slant of sunlight, I no longer saw just my landlady sitting in her garden. I saw a woman fighting quietly to keep her world intact, and, maybe for the first time, allowing someone else to see the cracks in her armor. The storm came suddenly, as storms often do. One minute, the house hummed with the soft buzz of electricity, and the next, everything went dark. The rain hammered against the roof in steady sheets, and thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. I was about to light a candle in my apartment when I heard a knock. "Power's out," Miss Harper said, holding a lantern that cast a soft glow around her. "If you'd rather not sit in the dark alone, I've got some tea warming on the gas stove." Her tone was casual, but the invitation felt more personal than neighborly. I followed her down the narrow hall into her apartment. The place was warm, lived in, books stacked neatly by the window, framed photographs on the mantel, the faint scent of lavender drifting from a candle she had lit. She moved with ease, though I noticed the way her hand lingered on the back of a chair, steadying herself, as if unused to sharing her space. We sat at her kitchen table, a single candle between us. She poured the tea carefully, her fingers brushing the rim of my cup before sliding it toward me. "Don't mind the quiet," she murmured. "It's been this way since my husband passed. Sometimes silence feels heavier than the storm." Her words hung in the air, fragile and unguarded. I didn't interrupt. I let her speak at her own pace, watching the way her eyes softened in the flickering light. She told me about the years she had spent keeping the property together, the loneliness that crept in when the day ended, and the quiet fear of becoming invisible in a world that moved too quickly. The candlelight traced the lines of her face, softening them, turning her into something almost ethereal. I found myself studying the way her lips moved when she spoke, the subtle tremor in her voice when she mentioned his name. And when she looked away, her hand resting loosely on the table, I reached across almost instinctively. My fingers brushed against hers, warm and steady. She froze, just for a moment, her eyes flicking to mine. Then, instead of retreating, she let her hand remain where it was, our fingers barely touching, yet connected in a way that felt more intimate than words could carry. The storm raged outside, but inside, the silence grew gentler, less empty, more alive. Sitting there, with nothing but candlelight and her presence, I realized something important. This wasn't about rent, or rules, or the distance of years. It was about two people sitting across from each other, finally daring to be seen. The next few days carried with them a subtle tension, like the quiet hum of a wire stretched too tight. I saw her less often, and when I did, her composure had returned, every word carefully chosen, every glance controlled. It was as if the stormlit evening in her kitchen had been folded away and tucked into a drawer she refused to open again. One afternoon, I caught her outside, locking the mailbox. She greeted me with polite efficiency, her tone brisk. "I've been thinking," she said, her hand still on the key, "we need to keep things professional. You're my tenant. I'm your landlady. It's better that way." Her words were steady, but her eyes didn't quite match them. There was a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze, as if she wasn't convincing herself any more than she was convincing me. I leaned against the railing, choosing my words carefully. Professional is easy. But real? Real is harder. And the other night felt real to me. Her arms folded across her chest, a shield she seemed to know well. People would talk, she whispered, almost to herself. They'd see it as inappropriate, a mistake. I stepped closer, not enough to corner her, but enough to remind her I wasn't afraid of the distance she was trying to create. Let them think what they want. I don't see a mistake when I look at you. I see a woman I respect, a woman who deserves to be seen for who she is, not just as my landlady. The words hung there, delicate and dangerous. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Her fingers drummed lightly against her sleeve, betraying nerves she usually kept hidden. Then, slowly, her arms dropped to her sides. "I don't know if I can trust this," she admitted, voice trembling with a mixture of honesty and fear. Without thinking too much, I reached out and let my hand rest gently on the back of hers. It was a simple touch, but the effect was undeniable. Her hand trembled beneath mine, not from rejection but from the weight of feeling she hadn't allowed herself in years. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let her hand rest beneath mine, her silence saying more than words could. In that pause, in that fragile space between resistance and surrender, I understood her struggle. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of what it meant to lower the walls she had built so carefully. And yet, for the first time, she wasn't holding them quite as high. The rain came steady that evening, drumming against the windows with a rhythm that seemed to quiet the world outside. I had been reading when a soft knock pulled me from the page. Opening the door, I found her standing there, umbrella in hand, hair dampened by the storm. She gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "The roof's leaking in my living room again," she said lightly. "Would you mind sitting with me until it passes?" There was no reason for her to ask. She had lived alone long enough to weather 1,000 storms. But in that moment, it wasn't about the rain, it was about not being alone with it. Her apartment was dim, lit only by the street lamp glow filtering through the curtains. The steady patter of rain became our background music as we sat by the wide window. She leaned her elbow on the sill, chin resting against her hand, eyes tracking the droplets as they raced each other down the glass. For a while, neither of us spoke. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full, charged with unspoken thoughts we didn't yet dare to voice. I watched the way her reflection wavered in the glass, softened by the rain. She looked younger somehow, as if the storm had washed away the practiced strength she always wore. When her shoulders dipped slightly, I shifted closer. Without asking, I let my arm rest along the back of her chair. She glanced at me briefly, her lips parting as though to object, but instead she exhaled and allowed herself to lean in. Her head came to rest against my shoulder, the weight of it warm, grounding. My chest tightened, not with discomfort but with the startling intimacy of it. I could feel the strands of her damp hair brushing against my shirt, the gentle rhythm of her breathing syncing with mine. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The quiet closeness said everything words couldn't. Her fingers, folded loosely in her lap, shifted slightly until the back of her hand brushed against mine. She didn't lace them together, not yet, but the gesture was enough. A silent question. A fragile bridge. I let my hand turn, palm up, leaving the choice to her. After a long pause, she placed her hand in mine. Tentative at first, then steady, as if she realized she no longer needed to hold the weight of the storm alone. Outside, the rain poured harder, but inside, the silence felt safe, two people sitting in the stillness, no longer strangers bound by a lease, but something deeper, something unspoken, something quietly alive. The storm had passed, but something lingered in its wake. A softness. A shift. The following evening, I found her in the courtyard, sitting alone on the old wooden bench that faced the garden. The air was cool, the earth still damp, carrying the scent of rain-soaked soil and roses. She didn't look up as I approached, instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the ground, as though lost in a battle with herself. When I sat beside her, she exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging in a way I had never seen before. No armor. No practiced poise. Just a woman caught between fear and longing. "I should apologize," she began, her voice low. "For leaning on you the way I did last night. For letting myself," she trailed off, pressing her lips together, as if admitting too much would unravel her. "You don't need to apologize," I said gently. I didn't feel used. I felt trusted. Her eyes finally met mine. They were tired, yes, but shining with something deeper. Vulnerability. She looked away quickly, as if the honesty in her own gaze frightened her. "I've spent years telling myself I have to be strong," she whispered. "That people would only see me as weak if I admitted I was lonely, or afraid, or wanting something I shouldn't want. And you're young, free, unburdened. What sense does it make for me to?" I reached across the small space between us, taking her hand before her doubts could finish forming. Her skin was cool from the evening air, but her fingers trembled against mine, betraying the storm inside her. "I never wanted lower rent," I said softly. "I just wanted you to lower your walls." Her breath caught. For a moment, I thought she might pull away, retreat back into safety. But then her hand tightened around mine, and her other hand rose slowly, hesitantly, to my face. Her palm cupped my cheek, warm now against my skin. Her thumb brushed lightly along my jaw, a touch so gentle it felt almost unreal. Her eyes searched mine with a depth that made my chest ache, a silent plea for reassurance, for permission to be unguarded at last. And then she leaned in, not with urgency, but with quiet surrender, resting her forehead against mine. Her breath mingled with mine, uneven, shaky, but real. For the first time since I had known her, she let herself be small, unshielded, entirely human. And in that moment, I understood, she wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of being seen. And now, finally, she was. The garden looked different that morning. Not because the roses had bloomed or the sun was brighter, but because she was sitting there, waiting, not as my landlady, not as a figure guarded by distance and formality, but simply as herself. She had set a tray on the bench beside her, 2 mugs of tea, steam curling gently into the cool air. When I approached, she smiled, an unguarded smile that softened her whole face. It wasn't the polite, careful expression she had given me countless times before. This one was real, warm, alive. "I thought you might join me," she said. Her tone was lighter than I had ever heard it, as if some invisible weight had finally been lifted. I sat down, close enough that our knees brushed. She didn't pull away. Instead, she slid one of the mugs toward me, her hand brushing mine in the exchange. The simple touch carried no hesitation, only ease, as though it was natural now to reach for me, to allow closeness without fear. For a while, we just sipped our tea and watched the garden come alive in the morning sun. Birds hopped between branches, raindrops clung to petals, and somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's wind chime sang with the breeze. It was ordinary and beautiful, the kind of moment that would slip unnoticed by anyone else, but for us, it meant everything. I glanced at her, and she caught me looking. Instead of deflecting, she held my gaze. Her hand, resting between us on the bench, opened slowly, almost invitingly. I laid mine over it, fingers weaving gently through hers. This time, there was no tremor, no pause. She tightened her hold, steady and sure. "You've unsettled me," she admitted softly, a playful lilt in her voice. "In ways I didn't expect. I thought I had locked parts of myself away for good. And now?" I asked. Her eyes softened, her thumb brushing over my knuckle. "Now I don't want them locked anymore." We sat like that, hand in hand, as the morning stretched on. There was no need for grand gestures, no declarations. The truth was in the quiet closeness, in the way her laughter came easier now, in the way she leaned into me without apology. She was no longer the woman guarding herself behind formality and rules. She was simply a woman, warm, strong, vulnerable, and she had chosen to let me in. The rent, the titles, the unspoken boundaries, all of it had faded. What remained was us, 2 people who had found something unexpected, something real, in the most ordinary of places.